Uh, we're recording session number 14 of New Testament Survey. We're all the way up to Luke chapter 19. This is the triumphal entry beginning at Luke 19 and verse 28. This is, in a lot of ways, this is the climactic episode for all of the Gospels. The week of Jesus' passion, his suffering, his arrest, the death on the cross, the burial, the resurrection is the high point of the gospel message. It's the set of the single most important things that have ever happened in history. We modern people often think that we're living in historic times. It's hard to tell if something is historic until 1,000 or 2 years have gone by, and we see what actually comes of it. With Jesus' trip to Jerusalem, where he was crucified and resurrected, turned the world upside down in ways that his own disciples at the time couldn't possibly imagine. And that world transforming event continues to echo down to our own day. We look at the sacrifice and the triumph of the Messiah as articles of faith and as a part of habit, and it's something we go to church on Sunday mornings to celebrate the resurrection. It's a part of the weave of Christian life, and yet these things actually happened in space and time history to people who had to live through them, and what the crowds must have been experiencing when Jesus walked past is just difficult to imagine. So I'm going to show some pictures, and we're going to take a look at some of the stuff. We'll scrunch over here to the share screen thing, which will allow me to do this. Whoops, there it is. Okay, so the ministry of Jesus in Jerusalem runs from chapter 19 through chapter 21. And this is primarily Jesus' teaching while he was in Jerusalem, but we're getting some other things. A lot of interaction with the Pharisees, which I find I always like that. Jesus had this thing with Pharisees, and he was always trying to get their goat. He wanted to make it clear that everybody knew that he had some disagreements with the Pharisees. And the Pharisees needed to recognize that they were not on the same page as Jesus. And so it's fairly interesting. This section we divide into two parts. Jesus' entry into Jerusalem is the rest of chapter 19 up through verse 44. This includes the triumphal entry and his weeping over the city. Then beginning at verse 45, Jesus goes into the temple itself. These steps in the background that you see looking so worn and dirty are the steps leading up to the Temple Mount that we often call the teacher's steps. This was the spot where Jesus would have gone to teach crowds. And so a good background picture for this particular scene. The description of the triumphal entry is here. We'll begin at, do I want to begin at, no, I want to begin all the way back at 28. When he had said these things, he went on ahead, going up to Jerusalem. They drew near to Bethphage, and here's this whole thing with the donkey, all of this going on. Untie the donkey, bring it here. If anybody asks, say the Lord has need of him. And the colt's owners did in fact ask, and here he comes. And so Jesus actually entered Jerusalem on a donkey, and the crowds were there expecting that this is the day that the Messiah has come, the king has arrived in Jerusalem, he'll take over his kingdom, he'll drive out the Romans, he'll establish his rule over the whole earth. Little did they know it wasn't going to work out that way. As he drew near Jerusalem, this is in verse 41, he saw the city. And the background picture here is from Bethany, which is near the Mount of Olives, looking toward the old city of Jerusalem, and for that matter, a big part of the new city of Jerusalem. It's not a very good picture because I've made it transparent so we could see the text in the foreground, but there's Jerusalem. He drew near, he saw the city, and he wept over it, saying, "What would you, even you, what that you had known on this day, the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes." So Jesus walking into Jerusalem, looking at the city, was weeping over the fact that these people really didn't understand what was about. For the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up a barricade. And I'm muting a few folks. Sorry about that. They'll set up a barricade around you and surround you and hem you in on every side and tear you down to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave one stone upon another in you, because you did not know the time of your visitation. Okay, the point Jesus is making here, one, he makes a prediction that Jerusalem will be destroyed. That would actually happen roughly 40 years after the time of Christ. In 70 AD, the Roman legions under Titus entered Jerusalem. Portions of the legions, the Syrian units of those legions, actually set fire to the temple. As Josephus tells us. And Jerusalem was destroyed. The walls were breached in many places. The city itself was burned. It was a typical time in the ancient world of the rape and plunder and pillage and burning of the awful things that besieging armies did to a city that resisted. Everybody wanted to make sure that a city didn't resist. Because if you resisted, you were in bad trouble. After this, Jesus went on into the temple itself, actually the Temple Mount area, and he was teaching daily in the temple. We see the image of him entering the temple and driving out the money changers and the sellers of animals for sacrifice. These guys were all corrupt. They were, in general, really bad people. And they shouldn't have been in there doing the things that they were doing, but they did. But as he's teaching daily in the temple, and the chief priests and the scribes, the principal men of the people, were seeking to destroy him. And in verse 48, but they didn't find anything they could do, for all the people were hanging on his words. So here they are in the Temple Mount region and in the public places where rabbis were used to teaching. And the chief priests and scribes kept looking for ways to get Jesus in trouble, and they couldn't find a thing because he was such a good teacher and all the people loved him. In chapter 20, the authority of Jesus is challenged in several different ways. We've got a parable of wicked tenants. What's the master going to do when the wicked tenants are found out? Well, he's going to destroy them and break down their walls. this one more picture of the destruction of Jerusalem and the scattering of Israel, which actually happened historically. There's a passage on the paying of taxes to Caesar. This is 20 and verse 19. The scribes and chief priests sought to lay hands on him. They perceived that he had told the parable of the tenants against him, which of course is true. I mean, what can you say? So they tried to get him in trouble again. Teacher, we know that you've been sent from God, so tell us, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus turned it against them and said, well, show me a coin. Whose picture is that on the coin? And of course, it's Caesar's picture on the coin. And Jesus says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but to God what is God's. The Caesar and God have two different bailiwicks, and Caesar ultimately is a servant of God. That's Romans 13. I was just lecturing through that this morning. We have a responsibility to Caesar, but we also have a much larger responsibility to God. So Caesar can have his part, and no complaints. But God must also have his, and Caesar owes God a great deal. So that's the point of that little bit. The Sadducees, of course, ask about the resurrection because they don't believe in the resurrection. Jesus used this against them because he knows that the Pharisees did believe in the resurrection. So he turned these two sects against each other, and that got him out of another problem. Beware of the scribes, the end of chapter 20. In chapter 21, there's what we're seeing here is usually called the Olivet Discourse. And here's a picture from, oh my, this is one of my favorite pictures. I do need to show you this picture. It's kind of it doesn't look like much from here. But I was standing taking this picture on the Temple Mount, about 100 meters to the north of the Dome of the Rock. So if we look to my right, if I turn 90 degrees to my right, there would be the Dome of the Rock. And the pillars that you see uphold a little roof, a little dome roof, over a piece of limestone in the floor of the Temple Mount that we call the Dome of the Tablets. It's actually, that's the name that is given in Arabic. That little piece of limestone, I believe, based on archaeological evidence, I believe that was the pedestal within Solomon's temple upon which the Ark of the Covenant stood. So that is the place. It's the only solid piece of limestone in the whole Temple Mount pavement. And the modern pavement dates back to Crusader times, or afterwards. A fellow by the name of Suleiman the Magnificent rebuilt the pavement around the Dome of the Rock. Excuse me. I should have a cough button when I need to cough, just like the real radio guys. Okay, so this we call the Olivet Discourse. Is going to start out with the widow's offering and some messages about the destruction of the temple, wars, and persecution. This is very similar to Matthew 24. For the most part, this discourse is a parallel to what we already have in the discourse in Matthew. Beginning at verse 5, there was some. While some were speaking of the temple and how it was adorned, he said, "As for these things you see, the days will come when there will not be one stone left upon another that will not be thrown down." So there again, this is the same thing that he's been saying. It's what he says in Matthew. And they asked him, "Teacher, when will these things be?" Specifically asking, when will the temple be knocked down? And what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? They're expecting some kind of a prophetic sign. And he said, "See that you are not led astray, for many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Don't go after them." Uh, what he's talking about here is the signs leading up to the second coming. I think it's a little more clear in Matthew than in Luke, but it's clear when we read them together that this is what he's talking about. What the disciples are wondering is, when is the temple going to be destroyed, and when are you going to set up your kingdom? What will be the signs that all of this is going to happen? The idea that these two events are separated by 2,000 years or more had never occurred to them. They're thinking this is all coming maybe next weekend or sometime soon. It's not years off. And he said, "See that you're not led astray. Many will come saying, I am he, and the time is at hand. Don't go after them. When you hear of wars and tumults, don't be terrified. These things must first take place, but the end will not be at once." So the idea that there are wars and rumors of war and tumult is actually a picture of the whole history since the first coming of Christ. How many wars have there been since Jesus left? How many rumors of war have people heard all through the ages? Which one of those was the sign of the second coming? So it's not a very helpful sign. He says things are going to be tough. There's going to be war. There's going to be conflict and oppression. In particular, there is an evil leader that John calls the Antichrist, which is probably not our best title for him, but it's what we use. This Antichrist will be a human leader, satanically empowered, to do terrible things on the earth. And he will lead a great many astray. He will set up a very widespread totalitarian government. He'll be a really genuinely terrible anti-God character. The arrogant king, the man of sin, the infamous ruler, Antichrist. We know that he's coming. And Jesus is just skirting around the edges of it. He will be running a sequence of wars. One of the things that I think is important about the Antichrist at the end of time is that he will not be ruling over a large, stable kingdom of some sort. He'll be in the midst of war. The various peoples that he conquers will revolt against him, and he'll always be fighting wars. Other nations on the planet will get angry with what he's doing, and they'll come and make war against him. And they will not all get together until the very end, when they decide it's time to make war on Jerusalem. That's when the fall of Jerusalem will ultimately happen. Okay, so here I am standing on the Temple Mount. I'm looking across at the Mount of Olives. The 7 Arches that you see up there is what we actually call it, the 7 Arches Hotel. I think it has an actual name. It's the Hotel Intercontinental Jerusalem, but we call it the 7 Arches for all the obvious reasons. This is what Jesus was looking at when he made this statement. So he said to them, nation will rise against nation, verse 10, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places, famines, pestilences, there will be terrors, and great signs from heaven. But before all this, they will lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and the prisons, and you will be brought before kings and governors for my name's sake. And this will be your opportunity to bear witness. Settle it therefore in your minds now, not to meditate beforehand how to answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom, which none of your adversaries will be able to withstand or contradict. You'll be delivered up even by parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you will be put to death. Okay, it's hard to know exactly when that all fits together. He's talking to Christians. You'll be delivered up to the synagogues because of your Christian faith. So he's talking to Jewish people, Messianic Jews, at the time of the end, who will be delivered up to the persecutors. And it's going to be a very, very bad time. Specifically, what persecution are we talking about? I think Jesus is coming all the way to the end time, to what interpreters call the Great Tribulation. I think that's the time he's looking at. The wars, the earthquakes, the famines, the pestilences, we can't name them. The terrors, the signs from heaven. Which particular signs? It doesn't say. The Old Testament prophets speak of the same thing at the time of the end. This is what Jesus is looking at. Then we come down to verse 20. And I'm not quite done yet. There's a lot to go. He's foretelling the destruction of Jerusalem, which happens in 70. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know its desolation has come near. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, those who are inside the city depart. Let not those who are out in the country enter it, for these are the days of vengeance to fulfill what is written. Alas, for women who are pregnant, nursing infants in those days, for there will be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people. Okay. Part of that may well be fulfilled in 70 AD, but there is considerably more than that going on. There'll be great distress upon the earth and wrath against this people, the Jewish people. They will fall by the edge of the sword and be led captive among all nations. This is the dispersion of the Jewish people by the Romans. The Jews were taken into all of the parts of what was then the Roman Empire. They were forced into life in the cities. They were not allowed to own property. And they became a permanent dispersion all over North Africa and the Middle East and what would become Europe. And Jerusalem, after the destruction in 70 AD, will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Okay, times of the Gentiles is a term that's only used here in the New Testament. Some commentators, Donna is worried about my green screen. Oh, it does that, yeah. Sometimes that happens, and sorry about that. Hi, nothing to see here, nothing at all, nothing behind the curtain at all. Everything is fine. I am the great and powerful wizard of yes. I'm sorry. Okay, so the time of the Gentiles. Well, a good question to ask would be, how important is the time of the Gentiles? Well, pretty important. This is not to be confused, as is typical amongst New Testament commentators, with a term that Paul uses. Paul says the church is going to take the gospel out into the ends of the earth until the fullness of the Gentiles comes in. I believe the phrase "the fullness of the Gentiles" is used 2 times in the New Testament, and both times by Paul. And what he means by that is that God knows how many from all of the nations are going to come to Christ, how far the church will be expanded. We're told over in the book of Revelation that this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed to the uttermost parts of the earth. to the ends of the earth, to the hardest to reach places on the whole planet. Now, when I was growing up, I thought that eastern Washington and North Idaho were the ends of the earth. I have discovered since then that there are other places that people are less likely to go to. And some places are really, really hard to get. Son number 2, Stephen, has trained to be a missionary pilot and mechanic to allow missionaries to get to literally the hardest to reach places on the planet. Some of those are actually in the Philippines. We still use mission aviation in Mindanao and some of the southern parts of the Visayan Islands. Papua New Guinea is not all that far away. From Manila, I can get to Port Moresby in about 3 hours. And Papua New Guinea is a mountainous island, a very large mountainous island with many, many hundreds of people groups who have never been reached. We don't even know their languages. It's a very interesting place to work. So there are places on the planet that we still haven't reached. We are in the first generation in the history of the world that has actually had the capability of taking the gospel to the ends of the earth if we would just do it. So it's kind of exciting. Over the last 20 years, I've had a lot of opportunity to travel myself, and I've never gotten to the ends of the earth. Much as I like to think so, Pampanga and Milan are not the ends of the earth. And you can't even see it from there. They're nice places that are accessible by regular airlines. But the fact that we can travel so freely means that it is possible to do evangelism virtually everywhere. And all that's lacking is the resources and the will to get it done. So the planting of the church will happen throughout all of the lands of the earth. That is happening. That's the fullness of the Gentiles. And that's a very good thing. That's a very positive notion. When I think about the fullness of the Gentiles, I think about churches being planted and people singing hymns and praying and leading one another to Christ and raising their children. And this is positive. This is a very good thing. Jesus' message here in Luke 21 is not a positive message. This is a negative message. For there will be great distress and wrath against this people. They'll fall by the edge of the sword, be led captive among the nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. The time of the Gentiles, then, is a period of time that is categorized by, one, a judgment on Israel as a whole, and Jerusalem specifically. It involves a trampling underfoot, an act of disdain and dishonor and of impurity. For Jerusalem to be trampled by anyone is just bad news. It's not a good sign. And specifically, it would be trampled underfoot by the Gentiles. Now, I think it's fair to ask the question, were the Romans the first Gentiles to trample Jerusalem underfoot? And the answer, of course, is no. Jerusalem was first trampled underfoot by the Gentiles in 606 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar took control of Israel. And the last king of Israel lost his power shortly thereafter. The governor was a placeholder, and Jerusalem was trampled underfoot by the Gentile nation of Babylon. Following Babylon, the Iranians, the Persians, took control of the ancient world, including Jerusalem. Following the Persians, Alexander the Great took over the world, including Jerusalem. And Alexander's world was absorbed by the Romans. When the Romans destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD, there was already almost 700 years of Gentile tradition ruling over Jerusalem. So the Romans weren't the first, and they weren't the last. The Romans were finally driven out of Jerusalem in about 640 AD by the Arabs. The Arabs, led by a desert prophet that they named Muhammad, drove the Romans out of Jerusalem and began to trample Jerusalem underfoot. A leader by the name of Omar, who may or may not have actually existed, took control of Jerusalem and began to establish Muslim rule over Jerusalem, and particularly over the Temple Mount. The Dome of the Rock was built about 700 AD on a spot about 300 feet from the place where this photograph was taken. And the Dome of the Rock marks the power, the authority of the Muslim Gentiles over the city of Jerusalem. Forever and ever, they are now the rulers of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem will continue to be trampled underfoot until the Muslim rule is removed. Now you say, but of course, Jerusalem isn't under Muslim rule today. The Jews live in Jerusalem. Yes, they do. But the old city of Jerusalem is still under Muslim rule, particularly the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is under the control of the Muslim Waqf, W-A-Q-F. And I'm not sure there's a correct way to pronounce that word. It means simply religious authority. And the religious authority that controls the Temple Mount is actually in Amman, Jordan. It's a group of Muslim clerics who meet to find ways to make it more difficult for Jews to ever come back onto the Temple Mount, and to make it difficult for Christians to come up on the Temple Mount. I've only been up a few times. It's always been difficult. It's always a pain in the neck. Christians are absolutely not welcome up there, but we bring a great deal of money, and so the Muslims are willing to put up with us. I believe that the Temple Mount itself, the half square mile or quarter square mile area that we call the Temple Mount, is the part that needs to be trampled underfoot until the time of the Gentiles is complete. And the Muslim power, of course, fell with the end of the Turkish Empire. But since that time, the Muslim nations have looked forward to the day that they could destroy the Jewish people, drive them back into the sea, and take this land again for themselves. Jerusalem and the Temple Mount itself are still under the times of the Gentiles, and we're still in that four-nation program for the end of times. This is what Jesus is talking about, and I think it's quite clear. Not everybody agrees with me, but that's all right. The lesson of the fig tree we've seen before. Watch yourselves. By the time we get to chapter 22, we're going to get up to the very familiar story of the end of Jesus' life. We see the plot to kill Jesus in verse 1. Chief priests were seeking ways to put him to death, but they feared the people. which is always a problem. Tyrants always have a problem with people. It tends to be that common, everyday, ordinary people would just like to worship as they please, raise their families in peace, and be left alone by the powerful regime at the top of the heap. And the people at the top of the heap don't like it when the people get uppity, because that means there's not quite as much money and graft and power for them. So the powers that be, the elite, the oligarchs who ran Jerusalem for the Romans, were looking for ways to kill Jesus. And naturally, Jesus had a betrayer. There's a principle here when we talk about Judas. Judas betrayed Jesus, and we always say, oh, Judas was such a bad guy, and he was. But please notice, Judas was a part of the inner circle. He was one of the 12. He had been with Jesus from the beginning. No one can betray us unless they are part of our inner circle. No one can betray you unless you have gotten close enough to them that they can damage you seriously. Now, I'm going to say something else that's very important. When you're having a ministry, you must get close enough to the people you're having a ministry to that they can betray you. Otherwise, you're not close enough. The risk is real. Jesus demonstrates that. Throughout most of history, the really great stories of assassinations have not been hired guns sent by the KGB with silenced pistols. The most standard assassins are servants in the inner circle of a king or a president's own group. People who are close enough, trusted enough to get to a position where they can betray. Judas was close enough to Jesus. He was actually at the Last Supper. And Judas betrayed Jesus. He sold him for 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, by the way. The rest of chapter 22, we see the Passover, the Last Supper. That's going to take place. A large upper room. No, we don't know where the large upper room was. We wish we did. And the Last Supper is instituted in verses 14 through 23. And Jesus here says, this is the Passover. I won't eat it with you again until it's fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Isn't that going to be a fun Passover, by the way? When we're all in heaven, when all of this trouble is over with, and all of the trials are over with, we'll all go to heaven, and that first Passover after the second coming is going to be such fun. And it will be the first time that Jesus will share Passover with all of us since the Last Supper. And I think that'll be kind of neat, kind of a neat thing, a looking back instead of a looking forward. And that time we won't be saying next year in Jerusalem, because we'll already be in heaven. And who's going to want to go back to Jerusalem? But anyway. So there it is. The Lord's Supper is instituted, and I'm not going to have it again until the kingdom of God. As take this and divide it among yourselves with the cup. I tell you that I will not drink it, the fruit of the vine until the kingdom. And he took bread and said, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." I think those words are important. We take the juice, we take the bread as a memorial What are we doing? We're remembering what Jesus accomplished in exactly the same way that the Passover was a memorial of the redemption from Egypt. So the Lord's Supper is our memorial of what Jesus accomplished on the cross in purchasing our own redemption. This is a really a very big deal. It's a very good thing. The Last Supper is going to happen, and they began to question one another. He says, "One of you is going to betray me." Eventually, out goes Judas. A dispute arose among them. I love the disciples. These guys have got no clue what's coming. They haven't got the foggiest notion. When you enter your kingdom, Jesus, which of us shall be the greatest of it? Oh, and he said, "Oh, you guys really don't want to know. The Lord God will assign what He assigns, but in the meantime, just play it the way it goes, okay? Because it's not going to get better; it'll get worse first." Jesus foretells Peter's betrayal in verse 31 and following. It says he's going to sift you like wheat. Peter says, "Oh, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death." And Jesus said, Peter, love you, but before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter said, "Oh no, I'll draw a sword. I'll start killing him." "Oh, Pete, put your sword away. Just leave it there, Peter." And Scripture is going to have to be fulfilled. Verse 39, Jesus goes out into the Garden of Gethsemane, which is on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives was named after the olive groves. I know that's a big surprise, but it gets its name because of all of the olive trees and because of the gat in the middle of it. The gat is the olive press that belongs to Simon or Simeon. So Gethsemane or Gethsemane is the olive press of Simon. That's the name of the place. That particular olive press is in a cave. That was a very common place to find an olive press. Sometimes they'd actually dig a cave specially for the olive press. And this is the spot where they went to pray. And Jesus said to his guys, "You stay here, pray that you do not enter temptation," as he knew that they would. And he went away about a stone's throw, and he began to pray, "Father, if you're willing, remove this cup from me." The cup he's talking about is the crucifixion. There's a real humanity here. We don't see this same prayer in Matthew because Luke is emphasizing the humanity of Jesus. There was nobody else with him when he prayed this. So I'm not entirely sure how Luke knew this, but we're told that Jesus prayed, "Let this cup be removed. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." Had there been another way, Jesus could have gone that way, but he chose the cross, and on it went. And he went off, he continued praying, drops of blood, and then he found his guys all fallen asleep, middle of the night. Then comes the arrest. The next paragraph is the arrest of Jesus with Judas at the head of the line. "Judas, there you are. Would you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" And there he did, kissed him, which is something men did in ancient times. We still do that a bit in Italy. And sometimes I do that in the Philippines, and everybody thinks I'm a little strange, but it's all right. It's all right. And when those around him saw what would follow, they said, "Lord, shall we strike with the sword?" And one of them, we're told in Matthew, was Peter. struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. Now, frankly, a good swordsman could take a head off. This was probably Peter. And Peter is the one who said, "I'll stand with you, even if it means to the death." Okay, Pete, thank you very much. And Peter whipped out his sword and took a whack, and the high priest's servant, who was most likely nobody and very likely not armed, ducked out of the way and lost an ear. And you could just see Jesus rolling his eyes and saying, "Peter, I love you, bud. Put your sword away." He grabbed the ear and stapled it back onto the high priest's head and healed him right there. And then went on with the arrest. And he said, "No more of this. Just quit it. Have you come out against me like a robber with swords and clubs?" Yes, actually, they have. Middle of the night, guns drawn, SWAT team against Jesus, of all people. The whole thing goes, Jesus is carried off by the soldiers, and at this point, it's not particularly clear if it was Roman soldiers or Temple Mount soldiers. I think it was soldiers of the high priest, security people. And Peter, at this time, denies Jesus 3 times before the rooster crowed. Peter wept bitterly. We're told that Jesus was mocked. He appears before the council, which is the Sanhedrin. We're going to discover in the Gospel of John that there are actually 2 episodes of this, but before the council, then he goes before Pilate, then before Herod, and then before Pilate again at the end of chapter 23. And Pilate just couldn't get out of it anymore. The buck couldn't go any further. And so he ordered the crucifixion. And we're told about the taking of Jesus, the scourging of Jesus. This was done by Roman soldiers. It had to be done by Roman soldiers. The Jews didn't have the authority to crucify anyone. Jesus was taken out by the soldiers, and he was hung on a cross, probably on the north side of the city, outside the gate, most likely near the Damascus Road. I think historically this is the most likely place for all of this to have happened. He was taken there and hung on a cross between 2 thieves who were also crucified at the same time. There was darkness over the land from about the 6th hour, around noon. And when the sun's light had failed, the curtain of the temple was torn. Jesus called out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." He breathed his last, and the centurion, seeing this, said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And I've always thought, Sarge, you were right. The centurion is a senior enlisted man with a kind of a junior officer's commission. He's a non-commissioned officer in the modern sense, like a chief in the Navy or a sergeant in the other branches of the Army. The sergeants, like the centurions, were responsible for training, for equipping, for deploying, for encouraging. The sergeant is the father confessor. He's the judge and jury. He's the professor. He's the gung-ho leader into battle. The sergeant is all things to his men. The centurion was exactly the same thing. Roman officers were typically political. They were appointed by the emperor to fulfill political promises. It was actually the centurions who took care of the army and fought the army when it needed to go into battle. Centurions are very, very important people. So here's a centurion who's in charge of this really nasty detail. Go out and crucify some people. Oh, gosh, Major, do I have to? Yeah, just go do this. And so the centurion is out there and looking up. He says, certainly, this man was innocent. In Matthew, he says, certainly, this was the Son of God. And he's right. He was right. You wonder what happened to him afterwards. The end of chapter 23, we see Jesus buried. A man named Joseph from a town of Arimathea had a tomb in the outskirts of Jerusalem in the midst of a garden. It was a working garden, probably an olive garden. And there were cisterns with water, and there were places to press olives. And we still see all of that today in a place very close to the place of crucifixion, which is called Golgotha. The two of them were nearby one another, but not more than several hundred feet apart. And Jesus was taken into this tomb that had not been used before. And on the Sabbath day, they rested. And then 24, we see the story of the resurrection itself, which we speak of every Easter. This is the central fact of Christianity. I use the word fact with emphasis. For the resurrection is not a spiritual reality. It is not a mythical reality. It is not a fictional fairy tale. The resurrection happened in space and time, in these old streets of Jerusalem, on a hill just north of town, in a cave where no one had been buried before. In that place, Jesus was laid dead. He stayed buried for 3 days. And on the third day, he rose again. And that is the reason that the church exists to this day. We go into all the world preaching the message of a crucified and risen Savior, because this is what really happened. And Luke is quoting eyewitnesses. In every other court in human affairs, the eyewitnesses that we have to the resurrection would be more than enough. Unless that court has the foregone conclusion that there is no God, there is no Jesus, the resurrection can't happen, and we're all going to hell. I don't believe that. I think the resurrection did happen, and the evidence certainly suggests that. Chapter 24, the main thing that I want to point out to you is the road to Emmaus story. This story starts in verse 13 of chapter 24. There are two men, two of the disciples, who are on their way to a village named Emmaus, which is about 7 miles from Jerusalem. It's actually right on the line between the Palestinian territories and Israel proper, just north of the main freeway from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv today. From Tel Gezer, the ancient site of Tel Gezer, you can see the place that we think is the ancient village of Emmaus. So this really happened. This isn't like the Bhagavad Gita with a chariot driver and his warrior who never existed, going to a battle that never happened, talking about things that aren't true. This is the real Jesus talking to two real disciples on a road that we can walk today to a village that we can identify today. This is all history. So that very day, two of them were going to a village named Emmaus, 7 miles, and they were talking with each other about all that had happened nearby. And while they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself drew near and went with them. And he listened to them. And I said, "What things are you talking about?" And they said, "Oh, I mean, you must be a stranger here. You don't know all this." And they told him about what had happened. The most important verse in the passage is at 27 and following. Let's see if I've got that. Actually, let's start at verse 25. O foolish ones and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets had spoken. Okay? Was it not necessary that the Christ should suffer these things and enter into his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things that concerned himself. So, what's Jesus doing here? He's opening up all of the Old Testament that points to the Messiah. There is a modern controversy within evangelicalism amongst scholars of the Bible about whether or not the Old Testament contains a messianic hope. It's a little embarrassing that people asking this question are actually claiming to be Christians. For Jesus himself began with Moses and went through all the prophets and interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. The whole of the Old Testament is the road that leads to Jesus. And from the first coming of Jesus, the coming of the kingdom is something we still look forward to. And the whole Bible speaks to us of this. If we know the Bible, we're going to be looking forward to Jesus. We couldn't have missed him if we'd known the Bible. So why do we study the Old Testament before we study the New Testament? It's simple. The Old Testament lays the foundation for the New. From here, Jesus goes with them. He disappears among them, and from here, the disciples get together. They decide what to do next, and they wait to see what will happen. Once we're done with the Gospel of John, we'll continue Luke's storytelling in the book of Acts. Luke and Acts form a continuous story. And really what we're seeing is the story of the planting of the ancient church, the story of the beginning of this body of Christ that we're all a part of. And Jesus accomplished everything that he needed to by the end of the Gospel of Luke. From there on, it's up to the disciples and their disciples and their disciples and us. And that's what we see in the book of Acts. Starting on Monday, we're going to begin in the Gospel of John. There is no way I can do the Gospel of John real quickly. I've gone very quickly through Mark and Luke. And I can't do that with John. So I recommend everybody. I love you all. I know some are not going to have the patience to go all the way through with me, but it could take us several months at least to get through the Gospel of John. I'm going to tell stories. We're going to define terms. We're going to look at the individual elements of Jesus' discourses in the Gospel of John. There's an awful lot in John that isn't in any of the other Gospels. John is doing an entirely different project, and it's very, very important. I consider the Gospel of John the second most important book in the Bible. Well, maybe the first. Of the two most important books in the Bible, Genesis and John. And we absolutely have to master both of them. And I gave you a lot of time in the Old Testament going through Genesis. We're going to do a very similar work with the Gospel of John because it establishes that Jesus is in fact the Son of God, who has become a man and lived among us to die for sin and be raised on the third day for our salvation. John is central to Christianity. It is a book that, quite honestly, we would have difficulty doing without. So when we get back together on Monday, that's where we'll be. I'm looking forward to it. And until then, let's see if I can make this. Bye-bye to everybody. I'm unmuting everybody so that we can say bye-bye. And lots of echo on the line. I love it. I love it. Bye-bye, everybody. We'll see you. We'll see you next Monday. God bless. Bye-bye.
Ciao a tutti.
Bye-bye.
Ciao.